Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine a philosophy that completely rewired human history, inventing the concepts of linear time, heaven, hell, and the devil. Today, we are tearing apart the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. But more than just history, we're plunging into the ultimate philosophical battlegrounds. The nature of God, the undeniable reality of suffering, and how this 3,000-year-old framework answers the very paradoxes that fuel modern atheism. If God is perfectly good and all-powerful, why does evil exist? What if God is good, but not all-powerful? Get ready, because your understanding of the cosmic order is about to be turned upside down.
Oh, it really is quite a ride.
Yeah, and just a quick note before we really plunge into this material.
Yeah.
If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Definitely.
So today we are taking your massive stack of sources on Zoroastrianism, and, our mission is to extract the deepest mechanics of this theology and ethics. We really want to help you understand the foundational structures that quietly underlie so much of Western thought, like long before the major monotheistic religions took their current shape.
Yeah, and looking through this stack of historical and theological research, the most striking element is that we're examining a complete paradigm shift.
Like a total reboot.
Exactly. Zoroastrianism didn't just add a few new rituals to the ancient world. It completely replaced the operating system of human consciousness, starting with how humans perceive time itself.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand the shift, we have to ground it in the context of where and when this is happening, right?
Right, so we are looking at the Iranian plateau.
Yeah, roughly between like 1500 and 600 BCE, and the central figure here is Zoroaster, Zarathustra.
Zarathustra.
He was a priest in this pastoral society of cattle herders, and their religious world was deeply polytheistic.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But the fundamental rule of that ancient world was that time was cyclical.
Right. History was just this endless repeating loop.
Exactly. The seasons change, things die, things are reborn, and the wheel just keeps spinning forever.
It just loops. Like humanity was stuck playing a video game that just loops infinitely with morally neutral characters.
That's a great way to put it. And Zoroaster comes along and essentially shatters that wheel. He introduces linear time.
Which changes everything.
It changes everything. History isn't a loop anymore. It has a definitive starting gun and, crucially, a final finish line.
Right. And you were saying this mechanical shift from cyclical to linear time, that's what creates historical consciousness.
Yes, because in a purely cyclical universe, ultimate progress is, well, it's impossible.
Because it all resets.
Right. Your actions only matter in the immediate practical sense because everything will eventually just go back to zero anyway. By changing the geometry of time from a circle to a straight line, Zoroaster proposed that existence actually has a direction. A purpose, yes. There is an ultimate resolution approaching.
Yeah.
But, to establish that forward momentum, he had to completely dismantle the divine hierarchy that his culture had worshipped for centuries.
Yeah, he looked at the existing pantheon of gods, the devas, and essentially recast them as demons.
Which was incredibly radical.
Totally. And he didn't demote them because they were weak. He demoted them based entirely on their morals. Like, if a deity promoted violence, chaos, or strife, Zoroaster declared that entity a demon.
It was a complete inversion.
Yeah. And then he elevated one supreme creator, Ahura Mazda, which translates to the wise lord. So going back to that video game analogy, Zoroaster steps in, points to a horizon and says, no, there is a final boss, there's a clock ticking down, and you have to pick a side based purely on what is ethically good.
And that right there introduces moral reasoning to theology.
Right.
Before this, divinity was largely defined by raw supernatural power. You worshipped a god of storms so it wouldn't, destroy your crops.
It was essentially bribery.
Exactly. It was a transaction based on fear. But Zoroaster asked this revolutionary question. Why should we worship beings just because they are strong?
Wow.
If a god uses its power to create suffering or chaos, it shouldn't be worshipped. It should be actively opposed. He judged the divine by its effect on human welfare and the cosmic order.
And Ahura Mazda is different because he creates through thought, right?
Yes. Conscious intention. Mind and wisdom become the ultimate creative principles rather than just like brute physical force.
But, okay, if Ahura Mazda is purely good and creates only through wisdom, that immediately creates a massive logical paradox when we look at the physical world.
Ah, the problem of evil.
Right. Where does a disease come from if the creator is perfectly good? This brings us to, honestly, the most intense philosophical battleground in these sources.
The big one.
Yeah, because if you look at the classic arguments that fuel atheism today, The primary one is the problem of evil, often called the Epicurean paradox. The dilemma functions like a trap. It goes like this. If God is all-powerful, he has the ability to stop evil. If God is perfectly good, he possesses the desire to stop evil. Yet, disease, war, and immense suffering obviously exist.
They do.
Therefore, the atheist argument concludes God must either lack power, lack goodness, or simply not exist.
And Zoroastrianism offers a remarkably elegant mechanical solution to that exact paradox.
Yeah.
It doesn't attempt to offer these complex apologies for why a perfect God would secretly, permit a child to get sick or a war to break out just to teach us a lesson.
Right. None of the God works in mysterious ways.
Exactly. Instead, it flat out denies God's absolute omnipotence in the present moment.
So wait, God is actually limited. Doesn't that diminish the majesty of a supreme being? Like, if I'm playing devil's advocate here, an all-powerful God who struggles in a fight sounds, well, not very godlike.
I get that. It feels counterintuitive if you were raised in a traditional monotheistic framework where God is entirely untouchable.
Right, like sitting on a throne above it all.
Exactly. But the Zoroastrian framework argues that absolute goodness cannot coexist with the authorship of evil.
Okay.
So Ahura Mazda faces a genuine, uncreated adversary, Angra Mainyu, the hostile spirit. Evil exists because a real, independent cosmic force actively produces it, not because God permits it or secretly orchestrates it.
Wow.
And what's fascinating here is how they prioritize moral goodness over sheer power. A perfectly good God who is in the trenches, actively fighting a war against an invading chaos that commands more genuine reverence here than an all-powerful God who sits back and simply permits suffering.
Oh, that makes sense. But wait, what about the end of the war? Does God win?
Yes. Ahura Mazda's limitation in power is strictly temporary. It's a necessary condition of the strategy he is employing to defeat Angra Mainyu permanently.
So evil is literally an invading force. It's not a necessary part of the design.
Precisely. To understand the mechanics, think of the concept of cold in physics.
Okay.
Cold isn't an actual energy source, right? It is merely the absence of heat.
Oh, right.
In this theological framework, evil functions as a parasite or a privation. Angra Mainyu creates nothing original. He only corrupts, deceives, and decays what Ahura Mazda has built. Evil is the absence of proper being.
That's fascinating.
It really is. And it's amazing how closely this mirrors what St. Augustine would argue thousands of years later in Christian theology, that evil isn't a created substance, but a lack of goodness.
That structural view of evil completely changes the function of the physical world, doesn't it?
Completely.
Because in many dualistic philosophies where you have this eternal fight between light and dark or spirit and flesh, the physical world is usually viewed as dirty or fallen or like a prison for the soul.
Right. The material is bad, the spiritual is good.
Exactly. But the sources highlight that in Zoroastrianism, the physical world is explicitly not a mistake. Ahura Mazda intentionally created the material universe as a strategic weapon. Like, it functions as a quarantine zone.
Yes, and the mechanics of that quarantine zone are brilliant. See, Angra Mainyu in his original state is pure, uncontained chaos.
Just abstract darkness.
Exactly. So Ahura Mazda created the physical universe as a closed system, time and space. By luring Angra Mainyu into the material world, the chaos becomes trapped within the bounds of linear time.
Oh, wow.
It is no longer an infinite abstract threat. It is contained. So the suffering we experience, disease, decay, natural disasters, that's the friction of this ultimate battle taking place inside the quarantine zone.
The crossfire.
Exactly, the crossfire. But the material world itself is fundamentally good because it is the specific mechanism designed to systematically eradicate evil.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If the physical world is a quarantine zone, and God is using it to trap and destroy chaos, what exactly are humans doing in it?
Good question.
Because we are dropped right in the middle of two opposing forces, right? Asha, representing truth, order, and creation, and Druj, representing the lie, chaos, and deception.
Right. Humans function essentially as the white blood cells within this quarantine zone.
I love that analogy.
And we operate with radical free will. In this system, there is no divine predestination where Ahura Mazda has already scripted every action you will take.
Because the outcome of the immediate battle is unresolved.
Exactly. Human agency is the deciding factor. Every single choice a human makes, every thought, every word, every deed, literally tips the cosmic scales. You're either supplying energy to Asha or feeding the decay of Druj.
The sources refer to this as the threefold path. Humada, Hukta, Huvarshta. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds.
Right.
It sounds simple on the surface, but the underlying weight is staggering. Like when you tell a lie, you aren't just breaking a moral rule, you are structurally empowering the devil.
Yes.
But when you tell the truth, you are directly supplying ammunition to the creator.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And because the physical world is good and because human actions are the primary weapons in this war, Zoroastrianism forcefully rejects asceticism.
Right. Which means withdrawing from the world to be holy is actually a sin. Like, taking a vow of silence or going to live in a cave as a monk isn't viewed as spiritual purity here. It's actually viewed as going AWOL. You're abandoning the battlefield.
That is the exact logic. Fasting, celibacy, and intentional poverty are prohibited.
Prohibited?
Yes, because poverty and suffering are the creations of Angra Mainyu.
Eh.
Fighting those things by building a prosperous, healthy, and educated community, that is your primary religious duty.
Wow, so you have to participate.
Absolutely. You are supposed to farm the land, marry, raise children, and create civilization.
Yeah.
It is an aggressively engaged spirituality.
But the internal mechanics of how you do those good deeds are just as strictly regulated, aren't they?
Oh, very much so.
Like you can't just go through the motions of building society. The sources detail a sacred prayer, the Hashem Vohu, which dictates this profound psychological standard. You must be righteous simply for the sake of righteousness.
This raises such an important question about moral motivation. The intention behind the action is critical here. You do not do good to earn a heavenly reward. And you don't do it out of a terrified fear of hell either. You choose Asha truth and order because it is intrinsically valuable. It is the structural law of a healthy universe.
Let's apply that to a modern scenario to see how demanding it is.
Okay.
It's the difference between giving a massive sum to charity because you want a tax write-off or like social clout versus giving anonymously simply because you recognize that alleviating poverty aligns with the fundamental order of the universe.
Yes. Doing it for the reward taints the action.
Completely taints it.
It's an incredibly sophisticated ethical standard that actually anticipates the philosophy of Immanuel Kant by thousands of years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Kant argued that true moral worth only exists when you act out of a pure duty to the moral law itself, stripping away any calculation of personal benefit. Zoroastrianism demands that exact level of pure moral intention. You aren't trying to buy off divine favor. You are choosing to align your own mind with the mind of Ahura Mazda.
So if every individual is carrying this immense weight, acting as a soldier, tipping the scales of the universe, what happens at the finish line?
The big finale.
Right, because linear time guarantees an ending. And if you're listening to this and you grew up in a traditional Christian, Islamic, or Jewish household, this is the moment where the architecture of your own beliefs starts to look incredibly Persian. Let's talk about the afterlife.
Right, so the eschatology, the theology of the end of the world, begins with individual judgment. The texts describe the soul departing the physical body and traveling to the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator.
And this bridge acts as a spiritual manifestation of your life's choices.
Yes. If your life was heavily weighted toward truth and order, the bridge is wide and easy to cross, leading into a state of paradise.
But if you spent your life feeding chaos and deception, the bridge structurally reacts to that corruption. The sources say it narrows to the width of a razor's edge, and the soul plummets into the darkness below.
The imagery is incredibly vivid, but, and this is key, the individual judgment at the Chinvat Bridge is only a temporary holding state. The ultimate resolution is the Freshokireti, the renovation of the world. And here, Zoroastrianism introduces a concept that was entirely novel in human history, the bodily resurrection.
First religion to teach this, right? But why do they get physical bodies back? Usually in ancient religions, the ultimate goal is to escape the physical body and exist as pure spirit.
Right, but here, every human who has ever lived gets their physical form restored. They require physical bodies because, as we established, the physical world is not a prison to be escaped. It is a sacred creation.
Ah, right.
A purely spiritual existence would imply that Angra Mainyu successfully ruined the material world and forced God to abandon it.
It would mean chaos won a partial victory.
Exactly. So restoring the physical bodies is the ultimate proof of Ahura Mazda's total victory over decay and death. Once humanity is physically resurrected, everyone faces the final collective ordeal. They all wade through a massive river of molten metal.
This specific mechanism of the afterlife completely blew my mind. According to the texts, for the righteous, wading through this river of molten metal feels like walking through warm milk.
Yeah.
But for the wicked, it burns with absolute agony, However, the purpose of that burning is not retribution. It doesn't burn you forever just to punish you.
Right.
It burns away the corruption. It purifies the soul. Wait, so for a religion that literally invented the concept of the devil and hell, it doesn't actually believe in eternal damnation.
It does not.
That completely changes the psychological function of hell. It makes it a hospital, not a torture chamber. It's an incredibly hopeful vision of humanity.
It really is. That shift from retributive justice to restorative justice is profound. Zoroastrianism teaches universal salvation. Hell is fundamentally a temporary reformative state. Once the wicked are purified by that molten river, once the disease of Druge is burned away, they are completely restored. Every single human soul is eventually reconciled with Ahura Mazda. Justice is served through the undeniable pain of the purification process, but mercy ultimately triumphs because the final outcome is universal restoration.
And what happens to Angra Mainyu, the source of all this chaos? Does the hostile spirit get rehabilitated in the river too?
No. The river of molten metal flows down into the abyss and completely annihilates him.
Just gone.
Because Angra Mainyu is not a created being. He is just the abstract force of chaos and non-being. He cannot be purified. He is ontologically eliminated. The quarantine zone served its purpose.
And the source of disease and death ceases to exist.
Exactly. And the universe is restored to a state of perfection, enriched by the conscious choices of humanity.
The structural parallels to later traditions are just impossible to ignore, like a cosmic savior, a final apocalyptic battle, the defeat of a great adversary, bodily resurrection, a final judgment. When the Jewish people were exiled in Babylon and subsequently freed by the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, they lived under Zoroastrian influence for centuries.
They did.
And following that period, the Abrahamic religions began to adopt highly developed doctrines of a cosmic devil, angelic hierarchies, and an apocalyptic end of time.
Yeah, and while historians and theologians often debate the exact mechanics of how these ideas were transmitted, the structural parallels are undeniable. The sudden emergence of this specific theological architecture in later Hebrew texts, and subsequently in Christianity and Islam, points to a profound cultural exchange.
Right.
Zoroastrianism essentially provided the vocabulary for the eschatology of billions of people alive today.
Bringing this massive timeline into the present day, what does this ancient theology look like now? According to the sources, there are only about 100,000 to 200,000 practicing Zoroastrians left in the world today.
Yes, mostly the Parsi community in India.
And they face severe demographic challenges because traditional communities often do not accept converts, and intermarriage is naturally shrinking their numbers.
That's true. But even with those demographic challenges, the living legacy offers vital insights, particularly when correcting historical misunderstandings. For instance, the persistent myth that they are fire worshippers.
Oh yeah, that myth completely misunderstands the mechanics of the religion.
Right.
The fire is simply a focal point. It is the purest physical symbol of Asha, of truth, order, and divine wisdom. Because light inherently dispels darkness and heat purifies. You don't worship the flame itself, you use it to center your mind on the cosmic order it represents.
Exactly. And that deep reverence for physical elements translates into a highly relevant modern ethic. Because the material world is a sacred weapon designed by a good God, human beings have a strict duty not to pollute it.
Ah, of course.
Water, earth, fire, and air must be fiercely protected from contamination. Many modern scholars view Zoroastrianism as arguably the world's first environmental religion, explicitly commanding ecological preservation millennia before the modern environmental movement existed.
So what does this all mean for you? It fundamentally shifts the weight of every daily action. Whether you are telling the truth in a difficult meeting or choosing not to dump waste into a river, you aren't just following arbitrary rules to be a good person. You are actively participating in a cosmic victory.
Right.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, looking at the implications of everything we've just unpacked. If the material world is fundamentally good, created specifically as a divine trap where human action can systematically destroy chaos and build order, what if our modern scientific pursuit to master nature isn't a secular departure from religion?
Oh, wow.
What if the very concept of historical progress, the idea that humanity's deliberate efforts can literally build a better future, is actually an ancient Persian religious artifact still operating deep in our cultural subconscious today? We think we're just building society through science and ethics, but maybe we are still running the original programming of the fresh Akureti.
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
The next time you have to make a choice between order and chaos, remember the mechanics of linear time. You might just be tipping the scales of the universe.